Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we embark on an apocalyptic adventure through the prophets and Revelation. Though it's a daunting task, we encourage you to embrace the challenge and find captivating truths from the mysterious parts of God's Word. Thanks for joining us. My name is Taylor Kirshner, and I'm joined here today by Andy Stoller and Joe Lehman. Rodney Pelzy is our man behind the mics. This week we are studying the entire book of Micah. Join us as we examine the historical context, unpack its imagery and promises, and review the prophecies of the small but mighty book.
Small but mighty indeed. I always find it helpful to spend some time setting the table before eating a great meal.
I tend to want to jump straight into the main course.
I know, me too. But let's take some time to look a little bit where the book of Micah fits into the course of history in the Bible. As we start into the book, Micah introduces himself from being from a town called Moresheth.
More where?
Yeah, Moresheth. It was a tiny city in Judah, southwest of Jerusalem. It was just south of Gath, where Goliath was from.
Wait a second. So Micah was from the southern kingdom, Judah, but he prophesied against the northern kingdom of Israel. I bet that went over well with them.
Well, in this book, Micah warns both the southern and the northern kingdom that judgment is coming. In fact, it was during Micah's time of prophesying that Assyria came and conquered the northern kingdom.
The end of the line.
Yes, sadly. The rebellion against God's covenant was so severe that Micah and Isaiah were the last prophets to the northern kingdom. We can read in Micah chapter 4 that Babylon was going to come in judgment on Judah. So it was close to the time of Micah's prophecies that Hezekiah was showing off the treasure houses of the temple to that Babylonian delegation.
Whoops, mega lapse in judgment.
It really was. Hezekiah was a godly king, and it was his humility, repentance, and reliance on God that set up the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem from the hordes of Sennacherib's Assyrian army. But later in the extra innings of his life, his poor decision with Babylon ultimately set up the endgame for the kingdom of Judah.
So give us some background on Assyria and Babylon.
Sure. So Assyria and Babylon were the two powerhouses of the ancient world during the last kings of Israel and Judah. Assyria was a very violent kingdom, with its capital in Nineveh.
That reminds me of the book of Jonah.
Yeah, exactly the same city. Jonah had gone to Nineveh about 50 years before Micah came on the scene. Assyria and Babylon didn't get along very well. In fact, they each took turns destroying the other country's capital. First, Assyria destroyed Babylon, and then several decades later, Nebuchadnezzar turned around and sacked Nineveh, ending the Assyrian Empire, just before Babylon turned its sights on the southern kingdom of Judah.
This perspective on history really demonstrates how the Lord is actually master of all nations, and not just Israel and Judah.
That's really true. God rules over the affairs of all men, for sure. He was faithful to his covenant with Abraham and Israel in spite of the faithlessness of both kingdoms. Micah sets up the beginning of this book with a vision similar to God coming to Mount Sinai to establish a covenant with Israel, with all the smoke and fire, the hills melting like wax. It's a real beautiful metaphor of God's power and holiness. But in Micah, God wasn't coming to establish a covenant. He was coming in judgment because the covenant had been broken. Israel and Judah flagrantly violated their promise to God for over 500 years. And specifically, Micah calls out the kings and prophets. The kings were called out for their theft and greed, and the prophets were called out for taking payments to deliver a false promise of God's blessing to the highest bidder. It was really a sad tale of men forsaking the covenant they made with God, and he had to deliver judgment, just like he promised he would do for unfaithfulness.
Well, this week we'll read some judgment and some hope. Micah's book is easily divided into 3 sections, and each section contains both elements.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the middle section, chapters 3, 4, and 5. In this section, Micah shares his vision of the New Jerusalem, capital of the entire world, a place of justice, a place where all nations go for wisdom. It's an apocalypse.
All right, let's review. An apocalypse. It's a vision given in time of crisis in order to give hope to the faithful. Break it down for us, Joe.
Sure. We've already covered a little bit of the crisis. During Micah's time, the wealthy of Judah and Israel were exploiting the poor and stealing ancestral land. Also, during this time, Jerusalem wasn't really a powerhouse. It was just one of many corrupt little cities languishing on the outskirts of the Assyrian Empire.
I'm sure the Jewish people were discouraged. That's not the plan Yahweh had for Israel.
Right. Yahweh had promised Abraham all families of the earth would be blessed through him. And the children of Abraham, when they came to Mount Sinai, God said to them that he was going to make them into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
So the dream had been lost. God's people were just another podunk kingdom paying tribute to the big dogs of their day.
Yep. God's plan was in crisis. Due to unfaithfulness in God's covenant, Jerusalem and the rest of Israel was doomed to fail. This was Micah's prophecy.
So let's talk about the vision, chapters 4 and 5 this week.
Micah describes a future when Yahweh will gather a remnant of Israel and make them into a magnificent city. The city will be the premier city of the world, and all the other nations will go there for counsel and justice. Who's going to be the king of this city?
Oh, I got this one. It's Jesus.
Well, yes and no. Remember, we need to see this vision through the eyes of the people who first heard it. They didn't know Jesus. The prophecy says specifically that the king on Zion will be from the line of David. He'll be born in Bethlehem, and his rule will be like that of Solomon.
But that is Jesus, Joe.
The New Testament authors understood the ministry of Jesus and the kingdom that he taught to be a fulfillment of Micah's vision. So I think we can go there too. But there's just one issue. Jesus ascended into heaven. And according to the author of Hebrews, the temple, which was once in Jerusalem, is now in the heart of the believer. So we don't exactly have a literal fulfillment of this vision.
That's true. But could there maybe be a time in the future when Jesus physically sits on a throne in Zion?
I agree. We may yet see Jerusalem become something like we see described this week in Micah. We can be confident of the fulfillment of Micah's vision. However, I think we should be humble when we think about how that might come to pass. Remember, Micah had a vision, but it was just a glimpse behind the scenes, not a video of the future.
In a way, this prophecy is already being fulfilled.
How do you figure?
My mind's drawn to a verse in Isaiah 26:1, where it says that the walls of Jerusalem aren't going to be made out of rocks, but they'll be made of salvation. The Hebrew word for salvation is Yeshua, by the way. If we follow the New Testament authors and their vision of the church as the new temple of Yahweh, then indeed many nations have already come into the city of God. We live in an age now when people from almost every tribe and tongue have come to taste the Lord's goodness.
Wow. Either way, that gives me hope.
Yes, whatever the future may be, God's promise is coming true. He is truly faithful.
I'll admit, guys, that Micah was a tough read for me. As I read through the book and began to study for this podcast, I found myself skipping over different lines or skim reading through hard parts and trying to find just the happy verses.
Let me guess. Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God?
You got it. It can be so easy to just take those good nuggets and run. But as I studied the book further, I did come to value the challenging side. And ironically, as God usually works, the parts I skip over became what I wanted to discuss with you guys and the listeners.
Well, don't leave us hanging. Go ahead.
It's a good thing you covered chapters 3, 4, and 5, Joe, because I was ironically drawn to the earlier and later chapters. I was especially drawn to Micah's wordplay in chapter 1. As a language enthusiast myself, I love how Micah played with the city names in verses 10 through 15 of chapter 1. I found it so interesting that he wove puns into his prophecies.
Puns? Explain what you mean.
Well, I did a lot of research using the Cultural Background Study Bible, which I highly recommend, as well as my normal study Bible. I also referred to the Enduring Word Commentary by David Guzik to help make sense of all these different names of towns and what they meant, as well as where they could be located. From what I understand, it's actually a debate whether these towns existed at all, or if Micah changed existing towns' names to fit the wordplay, or if the towns did exist, but then we have no record of them. It was a somewhat common practice for Jewish writers and prophets to change city names to employ a pun. This can be found also in the 4th chapters of both Amos and Hosea, which we read earlier this year.
That's so interesting. So the names of the cities referenced would have been close enough for folks to recognize where Micah was talking about, but he also tweaked them then to draw out almost a satirical feeling.
Exactly. In my study Bible, some of the cities were shown on a map, but not all of them, which left me a little confused. But between the 3 resources I mentioned earlier, I found different plays on the city names. For example, in verse 10, Beth-le-Aphrah is Hebrew for house of dust, so Micah told the citizens to roll in the dust or fully accept their judgment. Dust is also a connotation of grief and mourning, as shown earlier in verse 8. Then, if you go on to verse 11, the first town mentioned is Shafir. The name of this town sounded like the word beautiful,
which is really in contrast with the prophecy of nakedness and shame. So then what about Za'anan in that same verse? Verse 11, it says they will not come out. Is there a pun for that too?
Yeah, the name Za'anan sounded like the Hebrew word for exit or go out. When the enemy came, the people of Za'anan would not exit at all. They would be shut up in the city until it fell.
That's really great. Did you happen to find another one?
Yes, Moroth. The name of this town means bitterness, and they will, quote, wait anxiously for good.
So I'm getting hooked on this too. I mentioned earlier that Moresheth was Micah's hometown. He also prophesied against them in verse 14. Does that name have a pun?
Yeah, the name Moresheth sounded like the Hebrew word for betrothed or engaged to be married. Here he spoke of giving the city wedding gifts, in other words, parting gifts or dowry in some versions, as she passed from the rule of one husband, Judah, to another, the invading army.
So deliciously punny.
Here's a neat quote to wrap up the thoughts I had about the city puns in the first chapter. David Guzik wrote, "Though Micah used puns, this wasn't about clever word games. It went back to the ancient idea that a name wasn't just your name, but that it described your character and your destiny, sometimes prophetically. In showing how the name of these cities was in some way a prophecy of their destiny, Micah showed how our character can become our future." Listener, thank you for tuning into the Biblecast this week. We have now finished the 4 prophetic books believed to be written before the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles. Next week, we will start reading the books believed to be written in the almost 200 years of exile the Jewish people faced. We hope you have and will continue to dig into the true meaning of Apocalypse, finding the crisis, vision, and hope that each book has brought forth. In Micah's 7 short chapters, we see the echoes of God's grace and little bits of hope peeking through. We will see judgment in chapter 6, even though we didn't have time to discuss that vivid courtroom drama. As we close, I want to leave you with my favorite verses in Micah, because chapter 7 reminds us of God's character and his promises. Andy, would you mind reading chapter 7, verses 7 and 8?
Sure, Taylor. It reads, "But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Rejoice not over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me."